Welcome, all of you. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I direct the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College, and I'm very happy to welcome you here today to the Bard Graduate Center. This is the first panel of this year in our second year of the series, Blogging and the New Public Intellectuals. We're going to have the past panels available on our website fairly soon, including this one as well. And it's a series that I've been co-curating with my colleague Walter Russell Mead. And he blogs at Via Media, one of the really excellent political blogs in the country, and cultural blogs in the country. So I hope you'll have a chance to look at past talks and enjoy this one as well. And we have a number of talks coming up throughout the rest of this year and next, so you can pay attention at our website. You can also join our mailing list at the Hannah Arendt Center .org. So thank you for thinking about that. Today we have a really spectacular panel. I'm very excited for this conversation for a number of reasons. First, because the two people that Walter and I are going to be talking to are both superlative bloggers and tweeters and journalists. And also they both have a real intellectual interest in what it means to be a public intellectual. In fact, much of their writing originated in that vein. So let me introduce the two speakers. The first, right here to my left, is Jay Rosen, who's tweeting as we speak now. Turning our phones off. Yeah, please do turn your phones off. Jay Rosen is, I think, known to many of you. He teaches journalism at New York University. He is the author and founder of Press Think, which is his blog about journalism's, as he says it, ordeals in the age of the web. He launched it in 2003. That was actually quite late for him. He started doing things in this world. In 1999, he wrote a book, What Are Journalists For? Really before the web really had hit. The book is, but it's a book that's already beginning to think and rethink the crisis of newspapers at the time and journalism, and raises the question of whether journalists should be objective gatherers or whether they should actually be political actors. A very Arendtian question. And I think Arendt stands in the background of that book quite a bit, so we'll be talking about that. He's also started offthebus.net with the Huffington Post, which got people involved in different elections in 2008, 2010, and Assignment Zero, or newassignment.net, a program, open source reporting project that he did with Wired.com. He has a PhD in media studies from NYU. Our second panelist is Megan Garber, who's currently a staff writer at The Atlantic, a prolific blogger there. She was formerly an editor or assistant editor or editor at the Neiman Journalism Lab, where she wrote about innovations in the media. And when she was doing that, she talked a bit with Jay Rosen and wrote about the work he was doing in democracy and public intellectual culture. So that really is the reason for having them together on this panel. Besides wanting both of them to be involved. She has a master's in journalism from Columbia, a BA in English Language and Literature and East Asian Studies from Princeton, and she was the winner of the Mirror Award for the best article on digital media from the Benton Foundation for her article, Common Knowledge, Communal Knowledge in a Fragmented World, that came out in 2010 in the Columbia Journalism Review. So please welcome both Jay and Megan. So the way this is going to work is I'm going to say a little bit about the series, introduce, and then ask a question for both of these speakers. We'll have a bit of a dialogue. Walter will chime in with a few questions, and then we're going to try and open it up as quickly as possible to you to engage in the conversation as well. In a nutshell, the reason we have this series is that Walter, as you know, runs Via Media, a blog that has really captured for many people the aspirations for smart journalism on the internet. The Hannah Arendt Center has been for the last 4 years, but really only for the last 2 years, seriously trying to experiment with what it would mean to have intellectual approaches to thinking put on the web in a journalistic, blog-oriented format, and with social media as well. Hannah Arendt was someone who, as many of you know, refused to call herself a philosopher, and yet she was a deep thinker trained in the history of politics and philosophy and art. She was deeply worried about things like speed, unedited, spontaneous discussions or publications, the blurring of the private and public lines, the loss of gatekeepers in culture. And yet she was also someone who was deeply democratic, believed in the power and importance of revolutionary councils and free speech, and the importance of public speech that was not edited by elites. And so there's, one of the questions I always get from people who know about Hannah Arendt is, would Hannah Arendt have liked Facebook? Or would Hannah Arendt like Facebook? Or would she have liked Twitter? Or would she have liked blogging? And of course, I don't like to answer for Hannah Arendt. But I think the questions reveal something, which is that blogging, the internet, the new forms of social media are opening up whole new possibilities of democratic discourse that can be both juvenile but also intellectual. And in doing so, they offer both an opportunity and dangers. And we started the series in order to bring some of the people we think are doing this the best to talk and to reflect about both those opportunities and dangers. And so, having said that, let me begin. And I said that both Jay and Megan are people who've written a lot about what it means to be a public intellectual and its role in journalism. Jay's book, What Are Journalists For?, which again was written before the internet age, but I think it presciently names many of the issues that are now before us, really says that he wants to problematize the public. What is the public? A very important issue for Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt was deeply believed that what it meant to be human was not just to live in private, which she thought was also important, but to live in public, to not live, to have a world together with others in which your aspirations were not just about economy or family, but your aspirations were to build a common world together. And there's one view of journalists that has taken root in the United States and largely around the world, pretty much in the 20th century, which is that journalists are truth tellers. Journalists are people who don't offer opinions but just tell facts or truths. And there's another view that Jay Rosen has been behind in many ways, called public journalism or civic journalism, which is that journalists seek to, as he put it, see the public into a fuller existence. So I wanted to just begin by asking you to talk a little bit about that distinction and this idea of civic or public journalism, and then maybe how that led you to become an internet journalist, or what you think the relation between that is and blogging or tweeting or the internet.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for having us here. I think the first answer I would give to that is I wasn't very successful at private life. So I thought I would try public life. And in an interview I did about my Twitter feed, I said that I wanted to, my aspiration was a Twitter feed that is 100% personal and 0% private. Meaning that I want to express myself in public and sort of try to become who I'm supposed to be that way, but I don't want to reveal my family life, my home life, things that are meant to call the domestic sphere, because I don't feel it's appropriate to blur that divide. So to me, public life is very important precisely because private life is sacred. And they both have to work for us to be fully human. They both have to work for democracy to work. And in order for public life to work, journalists have to do more than simply flood us with facts. This is getting to the substance of your question. So I just wrote a piece that you could find listed in my Twitter feed today and yesterday. The first line of it is, making knowledge public does not a public make, which I think something like that is actually the last line in my dissertation, which was written in 1986, which goes to show that you just have to keep saying things over and over again for 30 years before people get them. So my conviction is that just publishing stuff doesn't actually create an informed public. In addition to that, you need argument, which is why I think opinion journalism is not like some poor cousin of the rest of journalism, but actually integral to what it should be doing. You need people to be engaged in the issues and problems of the day. In order for people to assimilate new facts, they also need a kind of structure of knowledge. They need to understand first before they can be informed. And so I'm interested in all of the things that have to be there along with recent information, reliable news, investigative reporting, and many of those things tend to get kind of marginalized by the journalism profession. So what I've tried to do is bring those things into the center, because what is the reason we care about journalism? Why do we care about the performance of the press? It's not for the glories of journalism. It's because we're supposed to have a public that can meet its responsibilities. One more point. This gets to Arendt. One of the things I learned from Arendt has to do with her experience as an assimilated Jew in Germany, watching what was happening in her country as the Nazis took over. And one of the observations that she made, this is not a direct quote, but it's what I took from it, is that the assimilated Jews of Germany lost the capacity to think politically. They lost the capacity to understand the real politics of their country. And the message that I took from her work is that for everyone, not for political junkies, not for specialists, but for everybody, if you can't think politically, if you can't understand what is actually happening in your society, you could lose your life. Because you misunderstand what's going on. So in the case of the assimilated Jews of Germany, when danger started to mount, when Hitler started to take over, they thought to themselves, but we're good Germans. Like, nothing's going to happen to us. We're Germans. They're talking about other people. And their inability to understand why they aided Hitler's rise to power, despite the fact that they were good Germans, the fact that they couldn't get that, they couldn't see it, meant that they lost their life. So to be uninformed, to be out of touch, to be ignoring politics is not like a lifestyle choice. It can actually let you lose your life. You can lose your sense of membership. So those kinds of discoveries kind of made the problems in journalism more serious, and that's why I do it.
Let me just ask one attempt to follow that a little bit. What then is the difference in your mind between an engaged citizen and a journalist? Or is there none?
There is. A good way to think about it is, let's think about it like a labor union, right? In a labor union, you have members, citizens, right? There's people in the union. You have problems. The union constantly has problems with deciding what to ask for, solving the problems of its members. You have power, which is like the owners. They have power. And if you're a labor newspaper journalist, you have a particular relationship to that community. You are yourself most likely a union member. You certainly believe ideologically in the union movement. But your job, if you're going to be good at it, if you care about what you're doing, your job is to say, this is what's going on, whether you like it or not. Right? The union leadership is actually fucking up. Right? Or, hey, they're misusing your money. See what I mean? So when you are the journalist in a community, you have the job of figuring out what's going on, telling people what's going on, whether they like it or not, obviously challenging the power structure, which may not want to inform members what's going on, right? And that's a different role than just being a member, even though the labor union journalist is a member.
Right.
So that's how I see journalists, is they are part of, not a part from the community, part of, not part from, but they have a unique job. But anybody who would step into that role would have that different job, right? And so that's how we can have accidental journalists, and we can have temporary journalists, and so forth. So I think of the journalist as a heightened case of the informed citizen. A heightened case of the informed citizen, who's like more informed, right? That's why they share, that's why they report. But you would do the same thing in a social situation. If you were more informed than your friends about what went on at the party that they missed, you would share what you know, right? And so that's a journalistic situation. So that's how I see it.
Great, thank you. We'll come back, but I want to bring Megan in. Megan, in that piece you wrote, Common Knowledge, Communal Knowledge in a Fragmented World, there were a number of phrases that strike me, right? She talked about the fragmentation of journalism and of the world, the daily need. We are consumers of Montessori news, you wrote. And there's this worry about democracy's common denominator, of a common, and you talk a lot about the way that people read news today in an echo chamber. But you also engage in this language of that the press exists not merely to serve the public, it exists also to cultivate a public in the first place, which struck me as similar to a lot of things Jay was saying. But I'm wondering how you came to that, and what do you mean by that, to cultivate a public as a member of the press?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm really interested in sort of attention and attention dynamics, and how and why people come to care about certain things, whether it's entertainment, whether it's the news itself, just why things matter to people in general. And I realized that the way I myself was consuming news was, I was following a very particular group of people on Twitter. I was, reading very liberal sources of news, trying to counteract that because I knew that wasn't exactly the ideal way to go. But I didn't like the way that I was actually getting my news and information, and I felt like there was this whole sort of universe of content out there and of information out there that I actually wasn't getting exposed to. And I began to look more into it and read Cass Sunstein, who talks a lot about echo chambers. And I have to say I'm a little bit less concerned now than I was back then. So things have evolved a little bit. But at the time, I really felt like, wow, there's a chance that we can all just sort of be in our bubbles and we can be publics without being a public. I think there actually was something valuable to the days when everyone was watching one newscast, and there are certainly many, many, many problems with that at the same time, and I wouldn't certainly want to go back to the 1950s or anything like that, but I do think that there is value in sort of convening people together, looking at one thing, talking about one thing, and sort of from a discursive perspective, sort of starting from the same place, I guess. And that was my main concern, was that we were losing that commonality. We were losing that one place where everyone joined, and then the conversation could go from there.
And can you say more about why you're less concerned about it now than you were then?
Sure.
It's only 3 years ago.
Sure, exactly. And I still think it's an issue, and I still think it's something that's important to talk about. But I've just in my own experience, again, I've being more on social media and just seeing sort of the dynamics of information as it's played out on the web, it does seem like there's more sort of diffusion, if you think about sort of like coffee and milk mixing, like everything sort of blends together at the end of the day. And I think, even though we do have our pockets of information and we do have our sort of, still very discrete publics, it seems like I'm getting the news that I should be getting. And it seems like, the web actually allows for exposure to a lot of ideas that I wouldn't otherwise be exposed to. So I don't think we're in an ideal situation, but I'm more optimistic than I was just a couple of years ago.
So to both of you then, you both began with a problem. I mean, Jay back in 1999, you in 2010 or so, which is we need to rethink journalism and think about how journalism can create or help cultivate a public. Do you think the internet is in some sense the answer? I mean, is the internet, with the increased activation, everyone's having their opinion or speaking their opinion through Twitter or Facebook or etc., is this what you mean by the cultivation of a public?
Start. I think it can be. I mean, the internet is not, it doesn't have agency, it's how we use the internet. But, I do think, one of the things that's most interested me is to see the way that sort of information itself and facts themselves are getting sort of, they themselves are becoming more discursive. You just even look at something like Wikipedia, where there is the story presented, the facts as we understand them at a particular moment, but then you can go to another tab on Wikipedia and there's the top page, and you can see this often enormous community of people debating back and forth about particular words and particular phrasings.
You come back tomorrow and someone else has changed the entry.
Sure, but I think actually that's very powerful, like just that agency that we have over what the basic facts are. I actually think there's something very optimistic about that. I think it obviously, that too can have its problems if it's misused, but I just think this ability that we have to sort of all be part of that conversation, should we choose to and should we want to, that fills me with a lot of hope, compared to what we had in the past, which was gatekeepers and print newspapers and newscasts, which were very sort of solid and top-down power sources.
I mean, there's a deeply Arendtian worry, which is one that she talks about later in her life, in the late 60s and early 70s, about the loss of the distinction between truth and fact, that both you are interested in. Of course, we know that all facts are in a certain way political, or at least all contingent facts, as opposed to logical facts. They're facts, they're always things that we agree on to make them facts. And if you do a little bit of postgraduate work in English departments, you know that facts can be undone. But for Arendt, the truth was, she said, the ground we stand on and the sky above us. That's a quote from the end of her essay, Truth in Politics. What she meant by that, in language that both of you are very evocative in both your work, that without some sort of common public world and some understanding of what holds us together and some common discourse, some common language, we are around a table here. The table is that which unites us and holds us together. If one person means by St. Augustine something, and someone else means tomorrow, the Wikipedia entry says something else, it's not just that we disagree, it's that we stop talking about the same person. And so, I understand, I take it to be what you're saying is, there was a problem when it was just rich white folks who set the standard.
Yep.
Which I think no one's going to disagree with. And yet one has to still grapple with the problem of what's left of this public and how public is it in the world we live in.
Wow, this is a really important question. First, on the echo chamber problem that Megan mentioned, sometimes I think that people who are worried about this echo chamber problem are just listening to each other. Get it? Now, on the more serious issue that you raised, it was good in a way, as Megan said, when everybody kind of had to agree on a common world of news, at least, because there were only a few sources of news. And there were great advantages to that, because it lent a kind of common basis to political life. And I understand why people are somewhat nostalgic for it for that reason. But I think the internet, to get to your other question, allows us to come closer to the original idea of the public, which was not that everybody sitting in the audience would have the same facts. That's not a public. The public is not an audience. The idea of the public was, the original idea of the public was a group of people who share the same problems, who talk about the news, who do have a common basis of facts, but they talk about it. They are in conversation about it. That's a public. And so from that point of view, the internet permits us to get much closer to the ideal of an informed public, because it does let everybody talk about the news. And what you see on Twitter, if you follow the right people, is exactly that. It's like talking about the news, right? And in some ways, very intelligent conversation if you filter it the right way. But the echo chamber problem is not an illusion. There is this thing about the internet that allows people to pick their own facts, choose their own conversation. And so today, I think the problem for us is that we can't rely on a limited channel media universe to create a common world of fact. Walter Cronkite has left the building. And that era is not going to return in our lifetime. And so now we have a much more fascinating problem, which is we can't have an informed public unless we actually choose it. We have to choose it. We have to, people as a public, and people at large, lots of people, have to actually choose to live in the present for us to have an informed public. And we know from watching politics that not all people are going to make that choice, right? So one of the things I've been trying to wrap my mind around, because it's just a mind-blowing thing, is I've given a word to it, as far as I've gotten, is to name it, as we now see something that I would call verification in reverse.
Mm-hmm.
Verification in reverse. So verification is you try to nail down, in fact, something that people thought was true. That's verification, right? Verification in reverse is you take something that's been nailed down as a fact and you increase doubt about it.
Yeah.
So the argument about Obama's birth certificate would be a great example of something that was already verified, as far as you can verify something, at least in journalism. In journalism, the most you can do is say, is there an official document that says from the state of Hawaii that Obama was born on this day? Yes, there is. Okay, that's verified, right? So in verification in reverse, you take that and you try and introduce doubt about it. And it was successful in many ways, right? So when you see something like that, verification in reverse, which is definitely aided by the internet, then you understand we're only going to have a common world of fact if we choose it. If we choose it. And there's where journalists, I think, have a responsibility not only to introduce facts, but to persuade us to choose it. That's a lot harder.
That's well said. Walter, do you want to jump in?
Well, one thing that I'm sure, on the one hand, we've been talking about the difference between the journalist and the citizen. I'm, the more I listen to you talk, the more I think it isn't a very bright line. Because I think if I were a member of a labor union and I saw that the labor union leadership was doing something underhanded, I would probably feel a duty to tell the other members of the labor union about
Talk about it, yeah.
Yeah. So, of course, I'm a journalist,
Right.
at least in part, so maybe
Exactly.
that just... But also on the other side, there's the role of the intellectual, of the politically engaged or public intellectual in this. Is that another name for journalist? Or is there a difference between those roles? And I guess for me, I sometimes think about my biggest problem with a lot of the journalism that I see today is not that it's unprofessional, but it's about such fundamentally trivial things, or that for example, what looks to me very much like a real change in Chinese-Japanese relations that has the potential to make the 21st century a lot scarier than people thought, disappeared from the American front pages during the budget battle, which in the end was, no one in 2020 will think about the budget battle of 2013. And it more or less also as a story played out pretty much the way one thought, that both parties would game this, and the one that was the least successful in gaming would have to yield, and it would probably be the Republicans, because the other guys control the Senate and the White House, and the Republicans just have a divided majority in the House. And so, in fact, this as a story, this more or less went down the track most people kind of thought it would go down. And yet it ate up all the oxygen in the room for 6 weeks almost.
That's right.
Now I could see that, in a local metropolitan Washington newspaper, many of whose readers were civil servants and contractors trying to find out if they go to work the next day. Yes. But I'm not sure if that was the National Press Corps. And it seemed to me that that story was important. I mean, it's one of those stories that's set up for the press to follow. It's a cheap story to follow because it's all in Washington. And furthermore, they're all leaking stuff to Boehner's aide wants to call you up and talk to you. And so, everybody is trying to feed you things. It's also for the press, you can rank who's got the best story, who's in the lead, who's breaking it. So it appeals to all that side of the press. It's a made-for-the-press story.
Right.
And then at the end of the day, too, in a sense, it supports a narrative that politicians would like us all to believe, which is that they are sincere ideological crusaders motivated by a profound concern for public good as their constituents see it. But there's a lot of evidence that what they're all planning to do is go into lobbying firms after they've piled up a certain number of years in Washington, that the political stance is something you do to play to the rubes while you increase your marketability on K Street later. And so in this sense, the press is colluding with power rather than challenging. And it strikes me that thinking about things like that is probably something an intellectual might think they would be spending more time on than a journalist. But it seems, can journalists really do their job without thinking about so? It's a very complicated question I'm throwing at both of you. But I'd be sort of interested to hear how you'd respond.
Well, yeah, there are so many things going on there. I think many journalists don't actually want to think of themselves as intellectuals. There's such a long tradition of anti-intellectualism in the field, and there was a mistrust of almost your own opinion, because that almost tainted the facts, and I think we're moving away from that, but we're moving away from it very, very, very slowly. And many of the journalistic institutions, especially the ones in Washington, still have this idea that, I cannot inject myself into this, and by myself, I mean, a better way to do things, and, a more sort of systemic approach to stories rather than a conflict-based approach. So I think, we're fighting a really, really long tradition, and it is going to be hard to change. So that would be my I guess, first answer to that.
Can I just, before Jay, Meg, I just have a question for Megan on this. You know, you've entered the field, what, in the last 6 or 7 years? Do you see yourself as a journalist? I mean, is journalism what drew you, or is being a public voice what drew you?
That's a good question. That's a really good, well, it's funny. So I actually started in education. I worked in education policy for a little while, and then moved into journalism from there. And one of the things that's really interested me is the sort of continuum between education and journalism. And, you know, in my mind, they're all of a piece, basically, and I would assume in Jay's mind as well, being a professor. But yeah, I think, I definitely do think of myself as a journalist, but I'm most interested in ideas. I mean, I never wanted to be a newspaper reporter. I wouldn't be any good at it, first of all, and second of all, it's not anything, you know, that appealed to me, because I'm interested in the broader sort of systems and scopes and stuff. And for better or for worse, often newspapers don't emphasize the systemic. I think at their best they do, but on a day-to-day basis, they often don't. So yeah, definitely a journalist, but I think more of an ideas journalist. And I don't know if I'd say, I'm not really interested in sort of getting my own ideas out there, but I'm interested in sort of exploring things publicly, I guess, would be a more accurate way to say it. I like the idea of sort of being in conversation with people and doing that in a public way.
Do you think about what's important when you know, or is it sort of like, almost like oh, that's fun, or that's interesting, or is it, no, this is one of the things people really need to be thinking about?
You know, I think both, actually. So I write for The Atlantic, and one of the things that we talk a lot about is a sort of, we call it a high-low approach to journalism, and it's this basic idea that both the silly and the incredibly significant can exist on a single platform. We can write about really, you know, silly things, and we can write about very important things.
I think they call it the BuzzFeed model.
The BuzzFeed, right, exactly, yeah. I think sometimes BuzzFeed might skew toward one end. I could give you 10 reasons why. But I do, I mean, I actually, one of the things, actually, to get back to one of your questions too, is I think, you know, the internet, because it has literally no limits, it can allow for so many more approaches to stories that couldn't have existed before. Instead of this one story on the sequester or on the shutdown, we can have 200, and you know, some can be told via memes, some can be told via rigorously ported, systemic-minded stories, and they can all sort of be there together. So I think part of being a journalist ideally right now and being a public intellectual is sort of, I think, deciding for yourself as a single journalist, you know, where you want to situate yourself on that continuum. You know, I think there's plenty of room to do the more silly stuff, because actually that gets people's attention. You know, we find that a lot of our, you know, sillier stories bring people to our site, and then they read the more substantial thing. They read the Jim Fallow's, you know, deeply reported story. They read the Ta-Nehisi Coates, you know, wonderfully poetic take on current events. And, you know, so I think it's kind of flows of attention, and sort of figuring out how to sort of make those work for you, and there's room for a lot within that.
I want to go back to Walter's question of, you know, where does journalist leave off and intellectual begin? There's a number of different ways to answer that question. One is sort of a material culture approach. You know, the journalists are the people that you find at the New York Daily News, you know, and people in the New York Times. Those are the journalists. Right. And the intellectuals are the people that you find in
on the Arendt Center.
Yeah, on the Arendt Center, right. And then most interesting to me are like, okay, so there's things like right in the middle, you know. And the Atlantic actually would be one of those things that we place right in the middle, you know. And then a little bit to this side would be the New York Review of Books, right? So that's one kind of answer. Another answer is that the journalists are in charge of the moment. Right? One of the things I always love about Arendt parenthetically is the way that she takes these closely related terms that we would often regard as synonyms and says, actually, they're completely different, right? And then the counterintuitive nature of that is where she fills in her explanation. So, journalists are in charge of the moment for sure, right? That's their thing. intellectuals are definitely in charge of the past, they're in charge of interpreting the past. But in the middle, between those two things, is the present. The present. So that's where I think journalists and critics, journalists and intellectuals actually have to argue about who has a better grasp on the present. And from my point of view, what distinguishes them is the way journalists work, at least in the US, is that they attempt to describe the present using the terms that the public and political actors use to do so. They can challenge those actors, they can say, well, you're not telling us this, or they can be adversarial, but they have to almost use the language that the political system is using. Whereas an intellectual is more able and freer to re-describe the present. And in my own approach towards commenting on the press, this is how I create traction, this is how I create tension between me and the profession of journalism, is that, and this is like my #1 method for operating as a critic, is I re-describe what they do. I don't accept their description of what they're doing. I use my own language. So if you've read my blog over the years, you would recognize some of the key terms of my language, like the Church of the Savvy, or the View from Nowhere. But I have like all these other terms that I've tried to introduce to re-describe what journalists do. Because if I simply accept their language, then I've accepted their worldview, and that's what an intellectual can't do, right? They have to kind of speak from their own worldview. So I would view the journalists are in charge of the moment, intellectuals are clearly in charge of the past, and where they do battle is over the interpretation of the present, and you see that played out sometimes on talk shows like Charlie Rose, where you find, you've been on Charlie Rose, haven't you? Yeah, but you might be on with like a Washington Bureau reporter or something like that. Wow, collision, right? Or in the op-ed pages, or in the Atlantic, right? That's where you see these things like collide, and the incommensurate languages of the two sides, I think, is really fascinating.
I would also think, though, I think all that's right, but I also think the definition of public intellectual now, especially as it's sort of playing out on the internet, is much more discursive and much more, you have to be a better conversationalist, I think, in some ways than you did before. A Walter Lippmann in the past, or, name your favorite public intellectual of the past, could just sort of present the ideas. There might be a little bit of arbitration that goes on talk shows and op-ed pages and, the New York Review of Books and places like that, but, essentially you put your ideas out there, end of story. And I think today's public intellectuals, the people that I think of, are much more in dialogue with readers, with fellow thinkers, and everything is just much more sort of discursive. And I think that's great.
Yeah, and you get attacked more.
Yeah, you do, that's true. Yeah, you have to have a thicker skin.
Oh, that,
Right.
Yeah.
I want to make a commercial here for some of the younger people in the audience to think about doing this, which is that when I talk to editors of like sort of magazines like Foreign Affairs, or New York Review of Books obviously still does a lot of it, but the American Interest and some of the others, when they work with older people, they often find you have these professors with great ideas but who can't write very clearly.
Right.
And these magazines spend a lot of time turning indigestible, unreadable prose into something that looks more discursive. Now my guess is that the economics of the internet are going to make that kind of editorial layering more difficult for more places. And that what it means is that there's going to be a bigger premium in your generation to be somebody who has good ideas but can also write about them clearly. And that that's probably going to be a bigger career skill for your generation than for mine. But anyway, so you're talking about the journalistic critic in a way as the intermediary between the public intellectual view of the world and the merely journalistic view of the world. Who is the equivalent? Does the journalism critic then serve the same role as, in a sense, the arbiter between the journalist and the public?
Well, we have people standing between the journalist and the public. people like Margaret Sullivan, public editor of the New York Times, is formally in that role, and I think she does a really spectacular job at it. Well, I think I try to play that role. I mean, I try to like interpret journalism to people who are not journalists but care about it, or worry about it, or are outraged about it. So I think journalism professors can play that role. Oftentimes, ex-journalists become very different when they leave. When they leave the newsroom, I can think of many examples of this, of people who now see their profession in a very different way, and they become very valuable. Some of those people, and also, you know, like bloggers are kind of in the middle there, because what a blogger is it's just, I think of bloggers as like obsessive readers, you know, readers of the news who are just completely obsessed with certain things or problems or causes or defects. And because they are so careful and obsessive in the way they track the news, they stand in a way in between journalists and the public. But it's a very good role to play. I mean, that's one of the most useful things you can do. If you're starting a blog, this would be one of the first things I would recommend to somebody who wants to be a blogger, is to take some niche, some section of the news, read it obsessively, and then become that intermediary between the news coverage and the users of the news.
I think we should turn it open. I was wondering, Jay just gave a piece of advice. Before we open it up, I'd like, Megan, what would you give advice? What would be the advice you would give to people who want to enter into this world today? How do they start?
Ooh, how do they start? Okay, well, my advice will be very cliche, but I actually believe it, which is truly follow your passion. If there's something that you are obsessed with, if there's something that just gets you so excited, even if it's random, even if it doesn't seem like it would obviously have a market or have a place in a traditional publication, follow it. When I was in journalism school, I was told repeatedly, be a newspaper reporter, you know, do it in a small town in Arkansas, work your way up, because that's the way to break in. And I was told this very earnestly by very well-meaning people. That would have been terrible for me. That would have just been the wrong thing on every level for me. And I'm so glad I didn't do it. And instead, I was really interested in sort of thinking about the media from these structural perspectives. So that's what I ended up doing. And I think it worked out really well for me. And I don't, you know, if you are interested in, you know, shellacking or something, I wouldn't maybe invest all of your resources in like starting a shellacking blog, but I would maybe, you know, like 50% of your resources while you're looking at other things. I mean, I do think that the internet actually, it really rewards passion and interest and sort of ongoing, you know, expertise in different subjects. And if you can use that to your advantage, I think it's really one of the best things you could do. So just basically don't try to fight against who you are, would be my main piece of advice, because I think it's easy to sort of feel like, oh, I need a job, you know, I really want to break into media, and I will do anything in order to get that job, and everything else will sort of sort itself out. And I think if you can sort of make sure you're on a track that suits your interests right from the beginning, that's the ideal.
Let me just add something quickly on that. I wrote a post a few years ago called Audience Atomization Overcome, which is a 3-word description of what I think a lot of internet publishing is about, audience atomization overcome. And briefly, what it means is there are a lot of people out there who are obsessively interested in small things that don't necessarily register with the larger audience. Let's just say it's red Corvettes. There's a lot of people obsessed about red Corvettes. But prior to the internet, it was impossible for them to meet each other. There's no way, because the person obsessed about red Corvettes in Maui, Hawaii, didn't have any way of contacting the person in Stockholm who was equally obsessed with red Corvettes. Okay? But the internet makes it really easy for those people to meet each other. Right? So the atomized group audience interested in the same thing can now meet each other. So if you become the journalist who assembles the information, tells the stories and provides, sustenance to that group, that is the easiest and simplest way to prosper online, is to be the meeting point for the previously atomized audience that can now meet each other through you.
And then just to add actually one thing to that, what news publications want more than anything is audience. So if you bring an audience with you, no matter almost what the
Golden.
topic, exactly, that's it, that's your currency, So if you have those followers, if you have those people that think what you write about is the awesomest thing in the world, that's great. I mean, very few news organizations would turn you down for a job.
So you're
so.
saying, since build a beat and then go find an employer.
Exactly, yeah. Not, I don't think necessarily in every instance that will
Right,
work, but I
right.
think in a lot of instances it will, and you'll be much happier for it.
Okay, so I'm gonna take a question. I'm gonna ask you to stand up, so we are taping this, so we just wanna try and hear you. So if you can project your question, and I'll repeat it if need be.
Okay, so I hope this makes sense. I have a lot of questions, but this is one. So I work for the deputy editor at XOJ. I don't know if you're familiar with XOJ.
I am, yeah.
Yeah, but we have, so what one of my bosses, what we do, or what me and my boss do, is I try to find really like stories that I guess like our audience and the wider audience of the internet will interact to. And then we reach out to those people and we have them write a first person perspective. So most recent example would be like the Daisy Coleman story in Maryville,
I read
which
it.
went
Yeah.
huge, yeah. And that started with me finding like a local news article somewhere. And she got like a lot of stuff from that. So I was just wondering what you thought of that, pretty much just taking breaking news and I guess kind of giving it back to the person in the story, and like, what are your general thoughts on that?
What do you mean by giving it back to the person?
I guess like giving them a voice, and
Uh-huh,
sometimes like if the person isn't like, they don't have the ability to write the story themselves, we'll ghostwrite or something like that, but it always starts with an interview from them or like, and their final approval of course. But it's just, because it's kind of like a different model, I think, than typical like news stories. I was just wondering like, do you think like that's sustainable, or like, just what do you think of it in general? I know it's like a really,
Well, that's okay.
yeah.
Well, this was one of the insights on which Huffington Post was founded.
Yeah.
From the journalist or traditional journalist point of view, Huffington Post is, the business model is, don't pay your writers. Right? This is like a very ethnocentric view of what that publishing model is.
Yeah.
So what it really is lots of people have something to say. Lots of people. Many of them don't want to be journalists. They don't care about being professional writers. That's not what they would be in it for, right? And making the Huffington Post available to them was actually really important, right? And nothing like that had actually been tried before. I mean, the New York Times op-ed page isn't that. It's not available to anyone who has something to say. I've been writing for 30 years. I've never been on the op-ed page of the New York Times, not once. And I'm a professional writer. Right? So that was a great insight she had. Medium, the new company that Ed Williams, founder of Twitter and Blogger, has created, is based on a similar idea, which is some people only have one thing to say, one important thing. There should be a site where it's really easy for them to do that. And that's kind of what you're doing. Not to say that Daisy has nothing more to say, but
Yeah,
that's
no.
sort of the model that you're, and I think that's really important, and the function that you're serving is important, because the idea of the public, as I said, is not an audience that's informed. That's passive, that's one way. That's silent, inert. That's not the public. The public is a collection of voices who speak to common problems. And sometimes the job of the journalist is simply to amplify that voice, or invite it, or to cultivate it, or just simply to assist the person. And part of the problem with, comment threads and just opening up space so that people can talk is that some people need more help than that. They need more help than post your comment here. They need more help than, here's an empty space, fill it with what you have to say. So that's why I admire what you're doing, is that I'm sure that Daisy required a little bit more than, hey, write us a piece.
Yeah.
Right? Because the number of people who can actually write a finished piece that's good enough for publication is 1% of the people who have something to say. 1% of the people who have something to say can actually write you a piece. And so what we really have to do is think of journalism, this part of journalism, the amplification of public voices, as an enabling profession. And I think that's what you're doing.
I thought it was interesting though that you brought up Helping Me Post, because I kind of know their managing editor and he doesn't like the XOJ model. So I don't know why that would be.
Yeah, I don't know why that is, but that's too bad for him.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yes.
So every other talk I've been to that's about journalism and the internet and where the field is going has been very fixated, it seems to me, on this issue of how the money's going to work. And we haven't really touched on that here, and I was curious about if there's a reason for that, if you would just prefer to look at the way that thoughts function and forget about ad revenue and paywalls. I mean, obviously on the internet you don't have to worry about printing costs, but I'm just curious about how you see that coming into play. Like, does an intellectual who's paid by a publication become a journalist, or does money give sources news organizations credibility? How do you see that functioning today?
You wanna start?
That's a great question. I'm really glad you asked it. I mean, I think, we've talked a lot about sort of systems here, and I think that is the key system that sort of undergirds so much of what happens. I mean, so the Atlantic for me was my first for-profit job, actually, and it was an interesting sort of lesson in how, we had to make a profit, and that changes the kind of journalism that you do. I mentioned, the need to sort of bring in audiences, that there's obviously a journalistic and informational aspect to that, but there's also a financial aspect to that, I think I really actually like how we've done it. I mean, I think it's always sort of a tension, sort of the making money versus the just altruistic, informing of the citizenry, and I think we've actually hit a good balance at the Atlantic, but, it does affect what you're able to do. I can't spend a month working on one single essay that is going to change everything that I'm going to be immensely proud of, because I wouldn't be writing anything else, and that actually does affect things. So I think for us it's about balance, but it's not just the business model here and the journalism here. I mean, they are always working in relation to each other. So.
Well, this is something I think about every day. The question you asked, the territory that you identified, is the number one problem in journalism today. Perhaps the reason that we didn't touch on it is that it's an unsolved problem, which a lot of people seem to have trouble with, this concept of an unsolved problem. Like all problems should have answers, sort of by right, as it were. But it's an unsolved problem, meaning that lots of very talented, very smart people are putting their minds to it every day. And we don't have one answer, and there's probably not going to be one answer. In my classes, I have one of my students here, she can tell you, we talk about this all the time, because it is very much the future of journalism, and I want my students to get jobs, and so I care very much whether there's going to be an economic model. So backing up a little bit, what I would say is all forms of serious journalism are subsidized, and they've always been subsidized. They were subsidized by the sports news. They were subsidized, as my friend Clay Shirky says, Best Buy didn't sign up to fund the Baghdad Bureau, right? They were subsidized by department stores and appliance retailers. They were subsidized by, in the case of the BBC, a tax. So all forms of journalism are subsidized. The forms of subsidy that worked for a long time are breaking down because of changes in technology and economics, and so we have to find new forms of subsidy. And we've located some of them, but a lot of the ones that we need to find, we haven't found yet. So this is like, as I said, it's like an unsolved problem, right? However, I don't share the sense of gloom and disaster that some of mainstream journalists approach this subject with, because I think the internet, which has destroyed the business model of journalism, has brought so many other great things to us that we have to celebrate that. I mean, there's so many more people involved in the news system now. It's so much more democratic. It's so much more open than it was. There was so much more opportunity for different voices. There was something quite unnatural about the stability of a monopoly-driven news system for so long. In fact, if you'll indulge me just for another minute on this, I consider myself like an Old Testament journalist. So an Old Testament journalist is somebody who identifies with the way journalism was before the news industry and the profession of journalism kind of gained monopoly control of it. So from my point of view, the traditional press is the press of Tom Paine, right? That's the tradition. That's like the Old Testament. And then this New Testament came along, in which you have monopoly providers of news, objective journalists, a few sources that are incredibly powerful, 25% profit margins a year, Newsweek editors who berate you if your expense account is too small because you're dragging down the average for everyone else, which actually happened like in the 70s and 80s, right? Because they had so much money that if you're not spending enough of it, you're like screwing it up for everybody else. That actually happened. Like that, I don't consider that to be journalism. That was like an exception. That was, that's like some offshoot that wasn't really correctly derived in the first place. So I'm an Old Testament journalist, and things are coming back to the tradition that we had before this gargantuan media complex took the news over. So I consider that to be a good thing. However, finding a way to sustain serious journalism, give people jobs, pay for investigative journalism, fund serious inquiry, all of that, that's a huge unsolved problem, and I spend a lot of my time and a lot of my professional energy trying to figure that out.
Shay, do you make any, I don't mean this, I just mean this, do you try and make money off any of your journalism? Or I don't know yet if you call it journalism at this point, but off your tweeting or blogging or other writing?
Generally, no. But I don't have to because, I have my academic salary, so I'm in a very privileged position. I'm quite aware of that. But I do have advisor relationships now with the news media, and I get paid for that. But it's not something that I could make a living off of. It's an addition to my academic salary. But I'm in this very lucky position.
Well, no, I understand that quite well.
Yes, right, you're an academic.
But I'm wondering, there was a time in the Old Testament, in not just journalism, but in writing and in public affairs, where people who, Hoffman was a lawyer or a civil servant, and Kafka worked as a civil servant, and people had other jobs, and then also did journalism, as did Tom Paine and others.
Right.
Very few people made their living in that era on journalism.
That's true.
And I'm wondering if that's actually what you're, not to say you have an answer, I hate to say that, but is that?
So the subsidy takes place in a sense from one part of the individual's career to the other,
Yeah,
rather than through the intermediary.
yeah, or spouse, it can be a
Yeah,
substitute.
yeah.
That's true.
You teach that too.
Hypergamy and the future of journalism.
Yeah, well, yes, that has always happened, and it continues to happen now. However, I educate journalism students. They want to go into the field of journalism, so I am very focused on getting them jobs.
Just to both of you,
In that world.
Megan went to journalism school, had some interesting things to say about the advice she got there. Do both of you think journalism school is the right path for someone who wants to do this today?
Yeah, that's.
Jay has to answer something.
No, it's a good question. I mean, I think J schools right now, I mean, it's hard, they're not a monolith in any way. I mean, there's just so much variation. I know for myself, I wouldn't think that just a straight up, you know, here's how to report, here's how to write, here's how to edit, you know, program will cut it anymore, because that's just not what journalism's about. So I think, you know, if you, I'll just, as just pure advice to you guys, like if there are particular skills that you do not currently have, that you think you need to have to get a job, and the only way you can get those skills is through school, I would totally recommend it. If you're doing it just for a degree, you know, just for sort of connections, I think those can be got in other venues, would be my general sense. And I mean, it's always a specific, you know, it's individual situations, but I think in general, I mean, I also think J schools, to their credit, are doing a lot of soul searching right now, trying to figure out, you know, how can we best serve students. There was a debate this past week about should journalism schools just teach code, computer code, as a matter of course. You might have heard about this. You know, or should they focus on other things besides, you know, like let reporting be done in the field certainly, but also, you know, teach students about civics and about, you know, data analysis and how to read scientific studies, you know, to see whether they're, you know, valuable or not. And, you know, all these skills that most journalism programs don't currently teach, but that are indispensable if you want to be a good journalist. So I think, you know, it's hard to say one way or the other, you know, should you or should you not, but I think J schools are going to get better as they figure these things out. And I think for you guys, if, you know, or for anyone else for that matter, you know, it's, if you want to get a specific skill out of it, then go for it. Otherwise, I would just learn on the job.
And frankly, it's one thing if you have to borrow money to go,
Yeah,
another
that's-
if you don't.
yeah,
Taking
that's
on a large debt is something you really need to think about.
Right. I mean, journalism pays really well, so.
Well, you know, Roger, 100% of the lawyers in the US went to law school, and 100% of our doctors went to medical school. And historically, about 40 to 60% of journalists have gone to journalism school. And there's lots of reasons for that. The first reason is that we don't have a licensing of journalists that would be against the First Amendment, right? So it's illegal, really, to say that you can't be a journalist if you have not gone through this kind of training. And so it's always been the case that you don't have to go to journalism school to be a journalist. And as a journalism professor, I actually support that. I think that's really important because it keeps the press free and it keeps the profession infused with renegade talent. I also think that the journalism school, as we've designed it in the United States, has been for a long time, even before the internet, misaligned to its two key constituencies, which is the profession and the world of work on the one hand, and the university on the other hand. So towards the world of work, what the journalism school has been doing is responding to the industry's demand to send us people we can plug into our production routine tomorrow.
Yeah.
Send us people we can plug into our production routine tomorrow. In the phone sex industry, you have to train for 3 weeks before they will let you on a call. This was actually in Columbia Journalism Review. I could give you the
I
reference.
somehow missed that, that's great.
Yeah, 3 weeks before they'll let you on a call. In the newspaper industry, one day you go around, you learn where the bathroom is, you fill out your forms in HR. The next day, you are sent out on an assignment, you're expected to produce a story, right? So that's what I mean by send us people we can plug into our production routine tomorrow. what they're really doing is offloading their training costs onto the university, which the university was more than happy to do because parents want that, students want that because it's practical, and the industry, of course, loves it, right? But that's not actually enough to justify a university-based education. Now, towards the university, what the journalism school did is say, we're producing the next generation of journalists. We're giving out the Pulitzer Prizes, like your school did. But that's not good enough either, because the function of the university in a modern society is to produce new knowledge. And one thing the journalism school has never answered really well is what kind of new knowledge about journalism is the J School making? And actually the answer, although they would never say this, but the answer was basically none. And so that's been the problem of journalism schools. So if you're producing people who could be plugged into the production routine tomorrow, what happens when the digital disruption and transformation comes and the production routine itself needs to change? You're screwed. So that's the problem in J School today. So that's how I came to try to design a program which I run now called Studio 20. Among my students is here. And our focus is on innovation in journalism. And we try and teach students how to produce new knowledge that journalism can use to improve itself, because that is a task that more befits the modern research university.
Let me just push you on that for 1 second. There's MAT programs, Masters in Teaching programs, have been highly criticized for teaching pedagogy, as opposed to teaching the subjects in which they are going to teach,
Right.
chemistry or English or history.
Right.
And many of the Masters in Teaching programs just churn out these people who are taught pedagogy and don't really know anything that they're going to go and teach, and don't have the authority to teach. This is something Arendt is very critical of in some of her writing, and she's not the only one. And I'm wondering how much of journalism should be about teaching new knowledge, as you put it, and how much of it should be saying, and Megan was saying before, pick your passion, or especially, you want to write about Corvettes, you should study engineering, and
Right.
or design, or you want to write about history, you should, get a master's in history, and write about it for the public instead of for an academic program. And I'm wondering if that's valuable, and if there are any journalism programs doing that.
Well, you're right, the same argument occurs in journalism. If you want to write about science, be a scientist. And I think there's a lot to that. That's why it's important that 40 to 60% of the journalism profession never went to journalism school. However, what I meant by produce new knowledge is not new knowledge in science, new knowledge in business, but new knowledge in journalism. Like new ways to do journalism, new ways of thinking about the task of the journalist, innovation in journalism itself. The only reason why we didn't think about the J School as the producer of new knowledge in journalism is that journalism itself was artificially frozen for decades by this monopoly situation that created what I call the New Testament complex in the press. So that's where I think a university-based journalism program can really help. It's producing new knowledge about how to do journalism in a way that really engages and informs an actual public. Now, it's true that people argue and have argued forever about whether we should just teach journalists to really know their subjects, or should we teach them to really know their journalism? And obviously, you have to be good at both, right? But how you get to the both is there's a lot of different ways to do that. So we have a program, a graduate program at NYU in science and environmental reporting, and we only take into that program people with undergraduate science degrees, because it's important for them to have that basis of knowledge. And then we teach them skills of journalism that they actually don't know. And I think there is something to that approach. So that's how we try to square that circle.
And Columbia actually did something similar where there was the MS program, which was the, reporting and writing, and then they added an MA program, which was more content focused on politics and science and business reporting, and tried to sort of do both at the same time. And I think all of that's right. I would add one thing, which is I would love for some kind of continuing education system in journalism where, just as a matter of course, there is some way to sort of, offer that kind of, every once in a while, just refreshment of knowledge. In the law, lawyers are required to do that as part of being lawyers. And I wish that there were something similar in journalism where, just to sort of remind us that, there's all this new thing, all these new things that are relevant to the field that, you may or may not be aware of. And I think that's true of journalism itself and then also of the content areas.
And I think in the internet period, it's going to be harder because, as you say, you're doing these short assignments,
Right.
short pieces, constant. You're going to be living off your intellectual capital, in a sense.
Yeah, very true.
And so, how do you develop the knowledge that kind of can allow you to say something interesting about 100 things in 1 month, which, believe me, is what a lot of entry-level journalist things are about right now. And this, again, let me just make a plug for liberal arts in your undergraduate years, but trying to learn some stuff, because it is going to get a lot harder to do that once you're out into particularly the early stages of a journalistic career right now.
Yes.
So I think, Jay, you kind of led off by talking about like how journalism is primarily political. And it seems like what, Old Testament and New Testament have in common is like, the journalist is a gadfly, speaks truth to power, is engaged in power structures, kind of all these things. And wondering if the internet kind of undercuts that. And it seems like, I make the case that the internet's really good at cultural production. Kind of talking about like Huffington Post, it's that, anybody who has anything to say, anything that's interesting, that's valid. Not as good at politics because, you don't, it's sort of disembodied. You lose some of your geographical focus, which is a key point in talking about politics. People who are really in positions of power don't necessarily have anything that they want. You aren't necessarily going to use the internet, and a lot of people who are giving their opinions aren't necessarily close to positions of power. So I don't know if you agree with that, and if that makes the internet, that it's good for kind of cultural production and politics in a way, whether that's a good thing, that changes the model of journalism, or whether that's something that needs to be countered.
Really good question. Well, here's what I think. I think the internet has been especially good for political junkies, right? That's the whole success of Politico.com. It's built on that idea of kind of shaving off the small number of people, which as a percentage is very tiny, but as an aggregate number is actually very large, of people who are intensely interested in politics and the game of politics, right? So that's what Politico is about. And the internet, with sources of news like that, along with political blogs, is really good at serving the intensity of interest of people who kind of have that as a passion. But in some ways, it turns the rest of the audience, the rest of the public, into an object of manipulation. And this is where my critique of what I call the savvy approach, the church of the savvy, comes in. What the savvy ideology, that's what I think of it as, an ideology of professional journalism does, is relay news for the insiders and privilege that perspective on politics. And then it turns everybody else into the objects of political technique. And so what's really insidious about the ideology of savvy, which is the ruling ideology at Politico, but also in most of the political press, like 90% of the political press, the ideology in command among those people is not liberalism or conservative, it's not the Democrats or the public, it's actually the ideology of savvy, in my view. That's what they believe in, that's what they reproduce, that is what they teach each other, and that is what they celebrate. The apex of that pyramid would be somebody like Mark Halperin of Time magazine. So in the savvy outlook, and it's not just journalists, it's a lot of people who follow those journalists. It's also kind of bled down into the audience. What it does is it severs the relationship between the political class and their fellow citizens by turning the rest of the public into objects of technique. And some of the names for this other class are like low information voters, they are dealt with through polls, they become demographics, they become like charts, people become numbers. And I think the internet has assisted in this kind of splitting up where we don't see our fellow citizens as members of the same political community. We speculate about how the latest story or appeal is going to affect them, as if they are like billiard balls in some trick shot, or as if they are like atoms in an equation. And it's a very insidious thing, and it's a very difficult thing to overcome, because among the savvy, that is seen not as ideology, but as realism.
Yes, there's a question back
None of the four of you have used the word that I expected at least someone to use, and that word was trust. I guess I'm a product of the Walter Cronkite era, where he was the most trusted man in America. When I write for the op-ed page, whether it's the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, I wear my opinion, my position on my sleeve, and you know it up front. When I read the New York Times non-op-ed page, or not the editorial page, I assume a certain level of trust. I'm probably being naive in doing so, but what is the responsibility of the person writing, coming into the profession, to establish and maintain that trust? And how do we judge the magazines or the newspapers or the blogs that we read for that trust quotient?
And I think your question is a good one, and I think some degree it's contained in the answer, transparency in some way. I'm a bit of an Old Testament guy myself in journalism, and that was an age before the sort of modern professionalized cult of objectivity journalism. You wrote for a Jacksonian democracy newspaper, and people knew what you were doing, and they knew that you were going to be reporting the news as it came from that slant, and people were not necessarily fooled by it. And I think the whole question of once news, essentially monopoly news organizations and professionalized writers start getting this cult of there is an objective truth about politics. And there are truths in politics, but politics wouldn't exist if there weren't a lot of contention about the meanings of facts or the salience of facts. So there's kind of there's a if perfect objectivity could give perfect truth about everything, we could essentially abolish democracy and be run by boards of administrators. Just who would just take the latest social science research and carry it out. That's not how things work. So actually I think we're coming back to a more genuine form of journalism in some way, where opinions are more clear and more integrated in the coverage. But again, I think there are people who are deceitful, who will sort of try to use a voice that's not authentic. And that needs to be criticized, and you yourself as a human being who's writing and engaging in this practice, you need to be grounded. What is it, you don't want to be trying to manipulate your readers. You want to be communicating with your readers. You want to communicate effectively, but you don't want to sort of lead them down the primrose path by artfully arranging deceptive ideas. At that point, you become a propagandist.
Go ahead.
It's ironic because objectivity in some sense was meant to systematize trust, right? I mean, it was meant to sort of
Yeah.
say, I, as the reporter with my editorial, backing, have already legislated the facts in the background. And now what we present unto you, dear reader, is the truth as we
I've taken
understand it,
an
you know?
oath
And-
of political celibacy.
Yes, exactly, on behalf of you, yeah. And so it's sad because that, that was sort of the way to signal trust was objectivity, which now is the signal of, opposite of trust, basically. But I agree, it is transparency, and the other thing I would add is it's humility. I mean, it's saying, it's admitting when you don't know something. Dan Gilmore, who was, one of the early bloggers and early journalists to do this, said, I don't know as much as my readers. I'm gonna ask you guys, help me out. And that informed his journalism, and it was wonderful. And I think now we're seeing that more and more. And I think if a journalist just admits when they don't know something, instead of trying to sort of affect, this sort of voice of God,
Yeah.
I may not know, but I'm going to tell you anyway. That's a huge step. So definitely transparency and humility.
I would urge you to consider two ways of persuading you to accept my account as a journalist. That's how I see objectivity. To me, objectivity is a form of persuasion. So think of these two different ways of persuading you to accept my account. In the first way, I get you to accept my account by saying, look, I don't have a view. I don't have a philosophy. I don't have a stake in this. I don't have an interest. I'm just telling you the way it is, so believe it because I'm telling you the way it is. So that's the way objectivity tries to generate trust, right? Is by saying, I don't have a stake, I don't have a view, so accept it because this is the way it is. Then there's another way of generating trust, which is to say, here's where I'm coming from, and this is what I believe. And this is who I am, and this is what I care about. And I've also gone out and done some reporting, and here's what I found. And those are different ways of generating trust. Now, I try to take an ecumenical approach to that. I think they both can work. They both can work. They're both valid. However, the audience decides, in a way, which one is more effective. Because if people don't believe you when you say, I don't have a stake, I don't have a view, I don't have an interest, I'm just telling you the way it is. If they don't believe you, what can you do about that? And so I think what we're experiencing today is a shift in the nature of trust from number one to number two, but it's not the journalists that are forcing that shift. It's the reaction of the audience, because it's just harder to trust somebody today who says, I don't have a stake, I don't have a view, I don't have any philosophy, I don't have any starting points, I don't have any assumptions, so just believe me because this is the way it is. It's just harder to believe that person. The reason it's harder to believe that person is we have so many more sources of information, there's so much that contradicts that person, we can look it up, right? We can argue back, that it's two-way instead of one-way. And so that method of generating trust just isn't working anymore.
But there's an element of trust in the question that I don't think's been addressed, right? Which is the New York Times. Megan, in that article you wrote, talked about how when the New York Times went on strike for 16 days, back whenever that happened, people were distraught. But the point is that there's trust from a system, there's trust from persons or a brand, there's trust from the people who can tell it like it is. But what we don't have today is trust that transcends different political viewpoints, different ideological viewpoints, different interests, different regional viewpoints, etc. And I think there is a question of whether we are in an age in which that kind of trust will be much more rare than it was in really what was an exceptional age in journalism. You know, the New Testament, as these folks are calling it, right? You know, that didn't exist in most of the world at any given time. It existed in the 1950s to the 1980s in the United States, and it was a rare time. And people look back on it with a kind of nostalgia today. But it's probably not coming back. And that kind of trust, we need to then think about the other kinds of trust that Megan, Jay, and Walter were talking about.
A lot of that, by the way, was that generation was so powerfully shaped by the experience of World War II,
Yes.
where a national leadership that very much included the press sort of followed a set of policies that everyone contributed to, even just by being drafted or whatever, and it led to victory and things were good. And so you can really look during the entire time, that period, the generation that lived through that is in power. You have a society that's kind of spontaneously more conformist in a way than American society was before or is becoming again now. So I think it was a confluence of kind of some oligopolies in the media world with a cultural climate that shaped a certain thing. It was very exceptional. It was not normal. Even your generation may sometimes still think of that's the normal. And what we now have now is some strange new thing. But actually, those were the weird years.
Well, and that makes me think too, I mean, you know, we talk so much about upheaval when it comes to production systems and business models and all of that in journalism, but it's upheaval for readers as well, and it's upheaval for audiences, and they're having to navigate this whole new terrain and sort of figure out, you know, if I know someone doesn't agree with me politically, should I still trust them? Should I listen to them? You know, with what sort of, you know, filters should I approach the information that they're giving me? And so I think that's a big part of it. You know, there's readers' trust in journalists, but there's also journalists' trust in readers to sort of, you know, appreciate that even if someone might disagree with them on one level, they can still make a good argument. They can still give you good information.
I think a lot, if you look at the demographics of who watches Fox News, a very large number of those people are actually Democrats, and even, you know, and minorities and other people who don't necessarily agree, but find it an entertaining experience. And that's, you know, and that's actually important in a way. The entertainment value of, you know, journalism can have an appeal that's independent of trust, even when you, well, you know, it's a great story about the Jews in Germany in 1935 saying, you know, I like reading Der Stürmer, which was the Hitler propaganda. What do you mean? He says, well, I read these other papers, and we're weak, we have no future. I read Stürmer, we control the world. And so there's a sense in which, you know, people's reading news, it fulfills a lot of psychological and cultural things other than a sort of a dispassionate quest for factual information.
Very true. We have time for one last question. If there's someone who'd like to, way in the back.
Hi, thanks. I think there's a tension between reporting and having a product that people want to read, and the responsibility to make the facts that are not readily known or the stories that are not readily known available to people in a democracy. And I think we suffer from this sort of a lack of that second sort of source of news stories that we need to be caring about greatly now. And there's stories that we know about, like climate change, but that don't get a lot of attention. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, part of making those stories more attractive for people that work in those fields is to find interesting pitches to make people like you want to write about them. But what's the responsibility from your side to, if the story the first time it was told didn't generate, you know, a million comments or a lot of interest, to find a way to tell it, because it is an important story that needs to be understood. And there are many of these. There's issues of slavery, there's issues of international trade. I mean, there's just a long list of issues that are not getting much attention.
So the question, if I understand it, is what's the responsibility of these folks to bring serious, sometimes underappreciated stories that have a hard time getting traction but are important to a much wider audience?
How do we get the public to eat their spinach?
Yeah, how do we get the public to eat their spinach?
Yeah. As soon as I hear that phrase, eat their spinach, I know that we framed it wrong. Because it does come up, and I know what you mean. just don't think that helps us. In fact, I literally just wrote a piece about this that was published 2 days ago. And I'll tell you what it was about. It was about, in 2010, the Washington Post did this amazing series called Top Secret America, which exposed the amazing growth of the security state and the surveillance state in the United States. Just this massive industry of companies, but also federal agencies that are engaged in classified spying on the rest of the country. And this series by the Washington Post took like a year to report. It was, the lead reporter was Dana Priest, one of their, basically their top person, two-time Pulitzer winner. 12 different journalists worked on it at various times. It was also a frontline documentary. It was massively persuasive in showing how the huge growth of this industry had been completely unmonitored. Nobody could even tell you in the government how much we spent on it. There was no oversight, there was no accountability. All the facts were laid out in 2010 in this series in the Washington Post, and it went nowhere. Nothing happened. There was no follow-up. There were no calls for reform. It, you know, did it win a Pulitzer? It might have won a Pulitzer. It did win a Pulitzer, but
it changed the way a lot of us thought about those things.
it did. It changed. People in the educated classes read it. I did. I said, "Wow!"
Yeah,
Like I didn't know about that. But it didn't have anywhere near the effect that the Snowden files have had. It didn't change the political dynamic in the way that the Snowden revelations did. So in my piece, I write about, well, why? Why is this? Why did one story, which documented this incredible crime in a way, and another story about essentially the same thing, register while the first one didn't? So some of the answers I came to is, the Snowden story is centered on the fate of an individual, and at the center of the Top Secret America was an issue. So that's one answer to your question. Another answer is that they showed, the Washington Post showed this story to officials in the surveillance state. And they all looked at it and they said, okay. You know, they had a couple of minor complaints, but basically they didn't care. Because they knew that nothing was going to happen. Whereas with Snowden, their secrets were being spilled. And so the presence of secrets has a lot to do with it. Secrets have power. And the Washington Post story assembled facts, but it didn't really expose secrets. So there's something in that. In the Washington Post story, the Post reported on it. People said, wow, great story, Pulitzer Prize. But the rest of the press kind of hands off. But in the Snowden case, the rest of the press descended on the story, and lots of other news organizations, but the ones involved, contributed to it. Also, there was like this suspense in the Snowden case. Suspense. What's going to happen? Can he elude, right, the most powerful forces in the world? Where will he end up? In fact, there's so much suspense, so much narrative drive in the Snowden case that the story is already being sold to Hollywood, literally being sold to Hollywood right now. Glenn Greenwald is negotiating with Hollywood studios for selling that story, right? So there's that. So we have this problem of some stories are really important, but they lack the narrative that would bring them to a larger public. And some stories are so strong on narrative, but they don't really tell us a lot about the world, right? And so we need journalists to be able to tell the difference, but we also need skilled storytellers who are kind of looking at what's true but unnarrated and figuring out how to tell that story.
And how to make it a story.
Yeah, how to make it a story And then at the same time declining the things that are great stories, but don't tell us much about the world. And that's where I find the ethics of journalism lie in that. You know, that's really the ethical part of journalism, is like telling the stories that matter, finding the things that matter, and turning them into stories.
And so I would add to that, I think the sort of Pulitzer aspect to that was actually quite important, because I
Yes.
think a lot of journalists have, you know, there's this sort of
Yes.
prize culture that we talk about, but a lot of journalists, I think, have this bias that if it is important, it is therefore also big, a little bit boring, focused on systems. I mean, we actually, in this sort of perverse way, almost prize boringness, because we associate that with the stories that need to be told.
Right, right,
Exactly,
right,
it's the
right,
spinach. And I think, you know, if I were at the Post during that time, I would have found different ways to tell that same story, you know, perhaps using some memes, perhaps, you know, using different tweets, and I don't actually remember what the Post did, so if they did that, then I take it all back, but.
They didn't do it well.
But yeah, I mean, I think that there are ways to sort of break down a story to make it interesting to people, and in many ways, journalism has this sense that if it's popular, it is therefore not important, and if it is important, it is therefore not popular, and I think that's something that we have to get behind, or beyond, because, you know, BuzzFeed, you can say what you want about them, but I think one of the great things they do is, you know, try to popularize important things and find creative ways to engage people. And Jay talks a lot about, you know, the sort of context idea of journalism and how you sort of get people up to speed so that they can be fully engaged with your stories and have that sort of knowledge base to understand what you're talking about and to appreciate the significance of stories. So I think it gets back to the humility thing. We need to not be so proud of our own work that, you know, we don't want to see it as, you know, as tweets and as memes and as Facebook posts. We need to sort of meet people where they are and appreciate that that's all part of journalism.
There's also a problem, I think, that in fact people do come to journalism, readers come in search of stories. And that means characters, it means plots, it means dramas, and 10 million slaves still in India. No one has clear idea what to do, okay? That is a condition and it's an important one, but it's hard to get from that to story. Now obviously, poor little Kim, all alone in the world, it's a start, but even there, if what it sort of does is it leaves the reader feeling depressed and no answer, it's a downer of a story, and that, because some of the most difficult sort of social conditions and political issues in the world don't lend themselves to the kind of narrative drive that people are looking for. And obviously you have to work hard to figure out how can you do that. But it is not, it's some of the most important things are in fact the hardest things to tell in a way that people find compelling. It says, when there's a problem, we want the answer. And if you can give me, there's a terrible problem, there's an easy answer, and there are these horrible selfish people that are trying to stop it. And there's this really noble person who's working against the odds to overturn it. All right, now I have a story. But unfortunately, a lot of the most important and compelling social problems around the world don't have that structure.
Yeah.
And you have to take into account that sometimes it's just accident. I mean, why did someone who burned themselves in Tunisia lead to a revolution and 80 people in Tibet have burned themselves and it hasn't? And one has to say, what makes one story catch on and one person become an example for others and another story not? To a certain extent, it's whether the story means something to the people, but also whether there's a storyteller able to tell it, whether there's a medium in which they can tell it and in which it can get out. And you have to keep trying. I mean, Snowden sacrificed something, and that is always a good story. He didn't sacrifice as much as someone who had stayed in the country, which is something, we could talk about. But, if he had, it might have even been a bigger story. Well, that's questionable. But I'm going to let it end here and I'll ask you all to thank Jay Rosen and Garber.